There is something strange about reading an ancient story and realizing that the place where it happened may still be standing beneath the modern world. A city mentioned in the life of Jesus can now be filled with traffic, shops, and apartment buildings. A river associated with biblical events still flows through the same region. A lake, where fishermen once worked through the night, still sits between the hills of Galilee. But there is a deeper question. If you traveled there today, would you actually recognize the world described in the Bible? Some places have changed almost beyond recognition. Others preserve archaeological traces that bring the ancient landscape surprisingly close. And in one case, even the identity of the mountain itself remains a subject of discussion. So these aren't simply 5 places from a religious text. They are 5 locations where ancient history, archaeology, tradition, and the modern world meet. And the closer you look, the more interesting the story becomes. Let's begin in a place that may seem ordinary at first. Nazareth. Today, Nazareth is a busy city in northern Israel. There are roads, businesses, modern buildings, churches, restaurants, and thousands of people going about their daily lives. But imagine removing all of that. Go back roughly 2,000 years. The Nazareth of the 1st century was not a major imperial capital. It was not Jerusalem. It was not one of the great commercial centers of the ancient world. It was a relatively small settlement in Galilee. And that detail makes one statement in the New Testament particularly interesting. When Nathanael hears that Jesus comes from Nazareth, he responds with the question, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Whether the statement reflects Nazareth's reputation or simply Nathanael's skepticism, it reveals something important. The place associated with Jesus' childhood was not necessarily impressive by the standards of the ancient world. That is exactly what makes modern archaeology so fascinating. Excavations and archaeological investigations in Nazareth have uncovered remains associated with domestic life from the Roman period, including stone structures, installations, and rock-cut features that help researchers reconstruct what the settlement may have looked like. Instead of imagining a grand city, the evidence points us towards something much more modest. Small homes, agricultural activity, simple stone construction, a community where daily life revolved around family, work, food, water, and survival. And that changes how you picture the biblical stories. Jesus did not grow up surrounded by the architecture of a powerful capital. He grew up in a small Galilean settlement. Today, however, one of the most recognizable structures in Nazareth is the Basilica of the Annunciation, a major Christian pilgrimage destination built around a site traditionally associated with the Annunciation. The contrast is remarkable. The ancient village was small enough that it could easily disappear into the surrounding landscape. The modern city is impossible to miss. Yet beneath and around that modern city, archaeologists continue to study traces of the older settlement. So when visitors walk through Nazareth today, they are not simply walking through a modern city. They are moving through layers of history. And Nazareth is only the beginning. Because the next place is different. It isn't a city, it is a river. The Jordan River. For thousands of years, rivers have been more than geographical features. They have been boundaries, routes, sources of life, and symbols of transformation. In the Bible, the Jordan becomes all of these things. One of its most famous associations comes from the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew describes Jesus coming to John the Baptist to be baptized in the Jordan. But here's where the modern story becomes more complicated. There isn't one universally proven spot where everyone can point and say, this exact patch of water is where it happened. Several locations along the Jordan are associated with the baptism tradition. One of the most important is Bethany beyond the Jordan, known as Al-Maghtas, on the eastern side of the river in modern Jordan. UNESCO recognizes Al-Maghtas as a World Heritage Site and notes that the majority of Christian traditions accept it as the location associated with Jesus' baptism. The site contains archaeological remains including churches, chapels, a monastery, caves, and baptismal pools. And this is where the landscape becomes unexpectedly powerful. You don't need to imagine a giant ancient city. The biblical setting is associated with a wilderness environment beside the river. Today, parts of the site still retain that relatively natural character. There are paths for pilgrims, archaeological remains, religious structures, and the river itself. Elsewhere along the Jordan, modern pilgrimage facilities allow visitors to enter the water for baptism. For example, Yardenit, near the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, welcomes pilgrims for baptism ceremonies in the Jordan River. So the river has acquired a strange continuity. People still approach its water for religious reasons. They still perform baptism. And they still connect the landscape with one of the defining moments of the New Testament. But the Jordan holds an older memory as well. In the book of Joshua, the Israelites are described as crossing the Jordan as they entered the Promised Land. That means the same river becomes associated with two very different transitions in biblical storytelling. For one generation, it represents entering a new land. For Christians, it becomes associated with the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. The river is not simply scenery, it is part of the story. And from there, we can follow the landscape north. Because not far away is another body of water that appears again and again in the New Testament. The Sea of Galilee. Technically, it isn't a sea. It is a freshwater lake. But in the biblical world, it was a working landscape. Fishing boats crossed its waters. Villages surrounded its shores. And people depended on the lake for their livelihoods. This is where the modern visitor gets one of the clearest glimpses into the world of the gospel stories. The surrounding hills are still there. The water is still there. And many of the same geographical relationships remain visible. That doesn't mean the landscape is frozen in time. It isn't. Modern roads, buildings, tourism, agriculture, and changing water levels have transformed parts of the region. But the basic geography remains remarkably recognizable. And that matters, because so many stories in the Gospels depend on this geography. Jesus is described teaching near the lake. Fishermen are called from their boats. Storms suddenly become dangerous. Crowds gather along the shore, and the disciples repeatedly move across the water. One of the most famous stories describes Jesus calming a storm. Another describes the miraculous catch of fish. And another depicts Jesus walking on the water. Whether one approaches these accounts through faith, history, or literary tradition, the physical setting remains real. There is still a lake. There are still hills around it. And there are still places where fishermen work. But archaeology gives us something even more tangible. In 1986, the remains of an ancient fishing boat were discovered near the Sea of Galilee after falling water levels exposed part of the vessel. The boat dates to the 1st century and provides a remarkable window into the type of vessel used by fishermen during the period associated with Jesus. But there is an important distinction. It is popularly called the Jesus boat, yet there is no evidence that Jesus or his disciples actually owned or used that particular vessel. What it does show is what a 1st century fishing boat in the region could have looked like. And that distinction is important. Good history doesn't need exaggerated claims. The boat doesn't have to belong to Jesus to be fascinating. It simply needs to help us understand the world in which these stories took place. Now move away from the water. Head toward the Mediterranean, and you reach a mountain associated with one of the Bible's most dramatic confrontations. Mount Carmel. The mountain range rises near modern Haifa. Today, parts of the Carmel region are known for forests, natural landscapes, viewpoints, roads, and urban development. It doesn't immediately look like the stage for an ancient religious confrontation. But according to the first book of Kings, this was the setting for the confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal. The story is built around a challenge. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. One question. Which God would answer? The prophets of Baal call upon their deity. Nothing happens. Then Elijah prepares his altar. And instead of making the task easier, he makes it harder. Water is poured over the sacrifice and the altar. Then Elijah prays. According to the biblical account, fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice. The story becomes one of the most dramatic demonstrations of faith in the Old Testament. But here is what makes the modern location interesting. Mount Carmel isn't a single isolated peak that has been preserved exactly as it looked thousands of years ago. It is a mountain range extending across northern Israel. Modern visitors encounter a much broader landscape, and although the precise historical location of every event described in the Bible cannot always be established archaeologically, the mountain itself is unquestionably part of the region's ancient geography. Today, religious traditions connected to Elijah remain visible in the area. Visitors can see sites associated with the prophet and explore landscapes that would have been familiar to ancient communities. The difference between then and now is striking. The biblical story describes confrontation, drought, political tension, and religious conflict. The modern landscape can feel quiet, green, peaceful, almost ordinary. And that contrast is one of the most fascinating things about visiting ancient places. The ground does not tell you what happened. The landscape doesn't come with labels. You have to reconstruct the past from texts, archaeology, geography, and tradition. And that brings us to the most complicated location on this list. Because here, the question isn't simply, what does the place look like today? It is, can we be certain this is the exact place described in the Bible? Mount Sinai. The biblical Mount Sinai is one of the most famous mountains in religious history. According to Exodus, this is where Moses encountered God and received the covenant and commandments. The story describes thunder, lightning, a cloud covering the mountain, smoke, and a people waiting below while Moses ascended. Later, Moses remains on the mountain while the Israelites become impatient. That leads to the episode of the golden calf. The mountain therefore becomes more than a geographical location. It becomes a symbol of law, covenant, revelation, and the relationship between God and Israel. Today, however, there is an important historical complication. A mountain in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula is traditionally identified as Mount Sinai, and the region contains one of the world's most famous ancient Christian monasteries, St. Catherine's Monastery. The monastery stands at the foot of the mountain traditionally associated with the biblical Sinai and preserves centuries of manuscripts, religious art, and Christian history. Pilgrims have traveled into this region for generations. Some climb the mountain before sunrise. From the summit, they look across a vast landscape of rock and desert. And for many believers, simply standing there carries enormous spiritual meaning. But tradition is not the same thing as archaeological proof. There is no universally accepted archaeological evidence that conclusively identifies the modern mountain, traditionally called Mount Sinai, as the exact mountain described in Exodus. Other locations have been proposed over the years, and scholars continue to debate questions surrounding the geography of the Exodus narrative. That doesn't make the traditional site meaningless. In fact, it makes it more interesting, because the place has become a historical landscape in its own right. For centuries, people have believed they were approaching the mountain of Moses. They built a monastery. They preserved manuscripts. They created pilgrimage routes. And they passed the tradition from one generation to the next. So when you stand there today, you're looking at more than a mountain. You're looking at the intersection of biblical tradition, geography, archaeology, and centuries of human memory. And that may be the most important lesson these 5 places reveal. The modern world has not erased the biblical landscape, but neither has it preserved it perfectly. Nazareth became a modern city. The Jordan continues to flow while different sites preserve different baptism traditions. The Sea of Galilee remains recognizable, even as archaeology reveals what ancient life around it looked like. Mount Carmel survives as a landscape associated with Elijah, even though the ancient world around it has disappeared. And Mount Sinai remains a place of extraordinary religious importance, while the exact historical identification of the biblical mountain remains debated. In other words, visiting these places today is not like stepping into a time machine. It is more like peeling back layers. Modern life sits on top of ancient life. Tradition sits beside archaeology. And the landscape becomes the meeting point between what people remember, what texts describe, and what researchers can actually demonstrate. That is what makes these places so fascinating. Because after thousands of years, the most surprising thing may not be that the locations survived. It may be that enough of the ancient landscape remains for us to stand there, look around, and ask the same question people have been asking for generations. What really happened here? And perhaps that question is exactly why these places continue to attract visitors from around the world. If you could visit only one of these 5 locations, which would you choose? Nazareth? The Jordan River? The Sea of Galilee? Mount Carmel? Or Mount Sinai? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the real places behind ancient biblical stories, stay with the channel, because there are many more landscapes where the modern world is still hiding pieces of the ancient one.